Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. We are starting this year's 2025 Sew With Me series with block number 1. So if you missed the launch video, which was the previous video, go back and watch that. It has all of the details for the sew along, so I'm not going to re-mention it in every single video. There's also a blog post that will be linked below this video that has all of the information as well. It has fabric requirements. There are links to the free PDF downloads as well, and then any other information that you might need for this year's sew along. So last week we made our outer borders and our bow blocks. We also made all of our sashing, so don't miss that video. That one is really important, so go back and watch that one first. Today we're going to go ahead and start off with block number 1. So here is the block that we're going to be making today. This is such a cute and fun block. I mentioned last week, but I am using my Believe fabric leftovers from my Christmas spools quilt for this. So it's going to be really fun. I'm going to have a holiday quilt when I'm done, but you can do this in any fabric colors that you like. I think patriotic would really be fun, spring colors, anything that you prefer. So again, here is block number 1. Let's go ahead and get started with today's tutorial. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to start off by making our flying geese first. So we're going to take our D squares, and then we're going to also take our G squares, and we're going to be making these one at a time because they're kind of a weird size. And then we'll also be using our G squares to make our flying geese. It's super easy. You're just going to take one of your D pieces and one of your G squares. Now, if you have a directional print like I do, I have my little houses, I want them to be going the right direction. And so what I like to do is just fold it so that I can see it on here. So that way I can follow this fold line. So I'm going to go ahead and place my fabric right side down on my piece. I'm going to sew right along that line, and when I trim it away and fold it back, my houses will be going the right way. Now you can either draw a line from corner to corner on your square. You can finger press it like I just did, or I'll show you when we get to the sewing machine. I have some 1/4 inch tape over here that I always use so I don't have to draw lines on my fabric. But as you can see, just pressing it gave me a good line to follow. So we're going to take this to our sewing machine. We're going to sew right along this diagonal line. We'll trim, press it back, and then we'll come back and we'll add our second square. So as you can see right here, I have my 1/4 inch tape, and I will link this below. This is Cluck Cluck Sew 1/4 inch diagonal seam tape, and it works perfectly for having those lines to follow on your machine. So we're going to go ahead and just line that up with the needle, and then I'll line this other end up with the red line on my table, and then that gives me a good guide to sew. So I'm just going to take a couple stitches up there, then just make sure that my corner is lined up down here, and then we can just sew. And so that's what that looks like. I'm sewing all of mine at a 2.0 stitch length. We're now going to cut it 1/4 of an inch away from that seam line. So I'm putting my 1/4 of an inch line right on the stitch line, trimming off the extras. You can save these for another project. And then now when we press this back, we've got that nice line. And I am going to come over here and just press it really quickly before I add my other piece. All right, so we've got our first one done. Now we need to add our second one, and again, I want my houses to go the right way. So I go ahead and just lay it on here the right way, like that, and then now I know that this is the diagonal I want to sew along, and I can finger press that just a little bit better and double check, so when I'm done and I fold that piece back, my houses will be going the right way. So now we're going to take this again back over to our machine and sew right on this diagonal line. So here is the second one. You can see my stitch line. I trimmed 1/4 of an inch away. We'll press that, and then we'll have our first flying geese. And then I always trim down my flying geese units after I've made them, just to make sure we're still on track. So this should be 3 by 5.5. We're pretty close. I got off just a little bit off on this corner and down here along this edge, so I'm just going to straighten it up. The other two sides are good. And there we have our first flying geese unit. I'm going to make 4 of these. So now I have these all trimmed up and ready to go. We can set these aside, and we're going to move on to the next step. Now our next step is our 4 at a time half square triangles. So we need our E and our I squares. We're just going to place these right sides together. For 4 at a time half square triangles, we're just going to sew all the way around the outside edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to then come back and cut it on the diagonal to make our 4 half square triangles. You may want to use a little Mary Ellen's Best Press or starch on your fabrics for this step, just because we will be cutting along the bias. If you're new to bias seams, fabric has grain, and you can see when we're pulling along the grain, it doesn't stretch too much, but if we pull along the side, it stretches quite a bit. That diagonal is your bias edge, and we will be cutting along that diagonal. So just a forewarning, this fabric isn't too bad, so I'm not gonna worry about it, but you can Mary Ellen Best Press that. All right, here's my square. I sewed around all 4 sides, and then when I was cutting, this one was just off just slightly, so I just went along the edge of the red one. It shouldn't matter on this because I usually give you a little bit extra when we're trimming things down like this. Next, we're gonna trim these, again, diagonally both ways. I like to use this diagonal line on my ruler, so I just line that right up there. I'm lining up the corners, right on the corners of my block, and then I just trim. I don't move anything. I'm gonna turn it the other way now, and again, I'm lining up that diagonal line and my corner points right here, and trim again. And now we'll have our 4 half square triangles. When I open these up, I'm going to press them all towards the red, the darker fabric. For most of these tutorials, you'll be pressing towards the darker fabric unless I say. Sometimes we'll be pressing open. It depends on the block a little bit, but I usually just press towards the dark. All right, and then we have our 4 half square triangles, and now we just need to trim these up, and we're trimming them to 2 1/4 by 2 1/4. So I'm going to take my ruler. I'm placing the diagonal line right along my seam line. It makes it really easy to see. And then here's my 1/4 inch line. So I just want to make sure I have room all the way around my square. So I'm just going to trim off those 2 edges first, and then I'll rotate her. And now we're going to line up that 1/4 inch line along the edge, just like that. Again, I'm going to make sure my diagonal line is lined up. And there you go. We have a perfect half square triangle. I'm going to do that to all 4 of them. And I like using this method. I like giving myself a little bit of wiggle room. That way, if my sewing isn't exactly accurate, or even if my cutting wasn't exactly accurate, I can trim them down and they'll be perfect to move on to the next step. All right, so now we have our 4 half square triangles all trimmed and ready to go, so we can set those aside. The next thing we're going to grab is our J and F strips, and we are going to sew these right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance just right along this edge. Then we'll come back and cut them down into the piece sizes that we need. This is called strip piecing, and instead of sewing 4 different pieces, we're just sewing them all at once. And here's our strip all ready to go. And now we can cut out our pieces. And so for this one, we're going to be cutting out pieces that are 2 1/4 by 2. And so I'm just going to line up my lines right here on my seam line. I'm just going to trim off a little bit off this edge over here so that I have a straight edge to start with. And then again, it's 2 inches. And we're just going to trim. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as you can see, I gave you a little bit left over on the side just in case your sewing was a little bit wonky. All right, so now these pieces are all ready. All right, next we're going to work on our corners. So we're going to need our K and L squares, and then we're also going to need our C units. And how we're going to put these together is the K's are going to be in one corner, the L's are going to be in the opposite, and the C's are going to go on the side. So we're going to sew the L and C units together. We'll sew the K and C units together, and then we'll sew those all together. So I'm going to do what's called chain piecing. I'm going to bring these over to my machine. I'm going to sew all these together at one time. I'm going to sew all these together at one time, and then we'll put them together. So as you can see, these are all still stuck together. That's called chain piecing. I did not cut my threads between the pieces. I'm also going to chain press them. You don't have to do this, but I like to. And what that means is I'm just layering them all right here. I'm going to give them a quick press to set that seam. And then I'm just going to go down and press these all at once. I realize I'm getting off my mat a little bit here. I'm just trying to make sure it's in video, so I normally wouldn't do that. Okay, so we do all that. We'll set that on there till it cools, and then we'll do the same thing with these. While this one is cooling, I'm going to go ahead and cut these apart. So I just clip those really quickly. And then we have those 4 pieces and we can set that there. And then these are done and we can just cut these apart. So as you can see, that was really fast. So now we're going to take these again over to our machine. We're going to line them up this way. We're going to sew these together. And because I pressed to the red on both sides, we're going to lay those right sides together. You can see here our seams are going in opposite directions. That means they're nested, and you just want to butt them right up next to each other just like that. And if you'd like, you can also put a pin at that junction as well so that it stays in place, and just prepare all of these, take them over to your machine, and I'm going to chain sew all of them together using a 1/4 inch seam down this edge, and then when we open them up, we'll have our nice 4-patch unit. I know I just told you to pin them. I'm not going to pin every single one of these, but if you're new, that can really help make sure that those seams stay straight. So I'll take this piece here, I line up that seam. I can feel it with my fingers. Just going to hold it in place, get a couple stitches down, line up the rest, and then keep sewing. And then here we are again with our pieces, again chain stitched together, so I'm just going to trim those apart, and then we can just bring these right over and press them. And I'll just set the seam, give it a little shot. And these seams aren't lining up with anything, so it doesn't actually matter which way you press these for this block. If it was lining up with something else, we might need to be careful about that, but we don't need to on this one. And then I'm going to set that there so they can cool. Okay, so we have all our units. We're going to trim these down. These should be about 3 by 3. There's not a whole lot of extra, but I still do go through and just trim them to make sure they're nice and square. And this is one of the tips I always pass along when I'm doing classes or sew-alongs, is to trim your blocks as you go, because if your pieces are more accurate, then when you put them together into your larger block, your finished block will be more accurate. All right, so we now have all of our pieces that we need to put our block together, and I do always go through and trim up each one of my sections before I move on to the next step. It takes just a second, and having each one of these pieces more accurate will make your final block more accurate. So that's a little tip that I always share whenever we're doing these sew-alongs. Trim as you go. If you do my patterns, I usually have trimming instructions for each one of these pieces as you go along. Not all patterns have that. Mine do, so just so you're aware of that. If they don't, you can also do a little math on your own and figure it out. All right, so we're going to go ahead and put together the center block first, and it's just a basic churn dash. So we've got our 4 corners like this. We'll have our side pieces like this, and then we just need our center H square there. And so we're going to sew together the 3 rows, and then we'll come back and sew those together. And so I like to just take this center row, place it right side down all the way across, and I'll take this all to my machine and sew all the way down this without breaking my thread in the middle, and then we'll come back and we'll add this 3rd row. So we're still here at the machine. I'm going to just press these open for now. I'm not worrying about which way I'm pressing them. And then I have my other 3 pieces right here. I'm just going to go ahead and add them right here at the machine. So again, I'm just lining that up. I'm going to sew down this edge, grab my next piece, place it where it needs to go, and sew. And then my last piece. If it makes you nervous to do it this way, also you can take this off the machine, cut everything apart, and then re-add that 3rd row. So we've got our 3 rows sewn together. And I like to take my piece now and flip it over and see which way it wants to go. You could press these seams open, but mine looks like it wants to lay this way. So I'm going to go ahead and press it that way and let it do what it wants. But either way, you want to press your top and bottom rows opposite of your middle row. So you can see my top and bottom rows are pressed out. My center row is pressed in. That's the way my block wanted to go. You could press these open if you wanted. I'm not going to do that. And now we can take this top row, flip it down on to our middle row. Again, because we press these seams the opposite directions, they should nest. So that seam and this seam should nest. I will go ahead and put a pin in it. Just since we have a couple of things coming together, I would just want to make sure everything stays nice and straight like that. We're going to take this to the machine, sew along this edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll then flip that back and then add this one. All right, and here we go. I'm going to press these towards the center. I like to press towards non-diagonal seams. I think it presses a little bit flatter, so since these are all straight seams on this center row, I'm pressing towards the center, so I'm not pressing up on this diagonal seam right here. You could also press this open. I'm going to go ahead and place my clapper. All right, and now we're going to trim up again before we move on to our next step. So this center should be trimmed at 5.5 by 5.5, and I'm just lining up some of the lines on my rulers on my seam lines, just making sure everything's straight. And then I'll just get rid of some of that. And you can see I'm not cutting off a whole lot, but that can add up over time and make your blocks less accurate. So I just like to trim every step of the way. All right, so our center is ready to go, and now we're going to put together our main portion of our block. And so we're going to grab our star points that we made earlier. I want to make sure that my houses are going the right way, so I'm just going to make sure they're all facing up. And that's good. And now we can come in and add in our cornerstones, which are going to go with our smaller blocks towards the center. You could do it the other way if you wanted. I liked it this way. Do we like it that way? Should we change it? This happens when I'm sewing, guys. I'm going to go with the small ones towards the center because that's the way I designed the block. But if you don't like that, you could definitely swap those. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing here. We're going to sew together row 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll sew those rows together this way. So again, how I'm going to do that is just place these pieces right sides together to my first row. I'm going to stitch all the way down, and then we'll add this row. So I am going to take this over to my sewing machine. I'm just picking it up in order and placing it on my sewing machine over here. Again, you can pin along this edge if you want to. I'm not going to. I'm just going to make sure everything's lined up and sew. I'm not much of a pinner unless there's something that I really am, worried about. Now for this one, I'm going to sew right down this edge. And if you want to make sure that you're not cutting off this point, you can come in and you can sew it from this direction and just make sure that your needle is going right on the inside edge of that point. I'm not going to worry about it too much, plus I want it to be going the right way for me to chain piece this block together. I'm just keeping to my scant 1/4 inch there, and I should be good. And then again, here's the bottom unit. Just make sure everything's nice and straight. And then we can pull our block back down, open up our pieces. I have my pieces on this side lined up and ready to go, so I can just grab that piece, place it right sides together, and keep sewing. All right, here is what our star is looking like. We just need to press this and then we can sew our rows together. And then I think because we have so many things coming together here, I think I'm going to press these seams open. All right, so I've just finger pressed those open. I think it helps just a little bit when we're pressing seams open to help just keep everything where they're supposed to be. I'm gonna go ahead and press that one, and then I'll put my clapper on there, and then I'll come over and do this side. Okay, so those seams are all nice and flat now. And again, we're going to fold up these. And now instead of nesting our seams, we've got all 4 of them coming together. So you just need to find that spot where they meet in the middle. I do like to stick a pin in that because I think it just helps everything stay where it's supposed to. And again, same thing at both of these junctions. And when I'm pinning those together like that, I do like to have my pin go in one side and out the other just to keep all of those seams together. All right, so now we can just take this to our machine, again, using 1/4 inch, sew down both of our sides. All right, we're bringing out the big guns. We're gonna let this sit on there for just a minute. All right, so now we've got our center, and then all we have to do is come in and add our B strips to the side and our A strips to the top and bottom. So we'll just set our A strips there for now. I'm going to go ahead and add my B strips, and I like to just pin on the edges and in the middle. That'll help even all of that out. So we're going to just sew down both sides using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll press those open and then come back and add our A strips. Our block is finished, but the last thing we're going to do, and we're going to do this to every block along the way, is we're trimming it up to 12.5 inches. I'm going to use the lines on my rulers, try and keep everything as straight as possible. Trim of everything. And I just barely trimmed off any, and here is block number 1 for our 2025 sew along. Okay, so I just wanted to show you my progress on the block number 1 stitching. So I've stitched ahead a little, so that's why this is covering up. I didn't want to spoil any. But here's my first finished block, and then as you can see, I did finish my border. All the information on what I'm stitching on is in the blog post, but this is just Antique White by Charles Craft. It's 14 count Aida. And then the floss that I'm using, because I wanted to try something a little different, is Classic Colorworks. So I thought I would just share that with you. So we've got Cocoa Bean, Pebble Beach, Grasshopper, 4-leaf clover, caroling, and pink posy. And I like all of these flosses. The only thing I'm thinking is that these 2 browns might not be quite different enough to show the difference. The stitches right around the outsides of the red are this cocoa bean, and then the ones in between are the Pebble Beach, and I don't think it was quite enough of a contrast. So I think if I stitch this again, I might choose a different brown. But I did want to show you the DMC floss as well. So here's the 2 browns that we're using for the DMC floss, along with the pink, the green, and the red. And so I think these colors actually work really nicely. I almost wonder if the browns would have been a little bit easier to differentiate if I'd used the DMC. So just so that you can see it in person, the flosses next to each other, I thought you might like to see that difference. And I might have even been better off using the DMC light brown if I wanted to continue using my Classic Colorworks. So that's just me. I've never used this floss before, so I wanted to try something different. So the Classic Colorworks floss is about $2.58 a skein, and it's 5 yards each, which is about 51 cents, or 52 if you want to round up, cents per yard. So there's less yardage on these than the DMC skeins. The DMC floss has 8.7 yards on it. It is 89 cents each, and that means it's only about 10 cents per yard. So this is obviously a lot less expensive than the hand-dyed flosses. The hand-dyed flosses are supposed to have a little bit more variegation in them when you're stitching because they are hand-dyed. I can't see them too much in some of these colors, but you might be able to see a little bit in this green where some is a little bit lighter. Like there's some lighter spots in there and darker spots. But as I've been stitching so far, I haven't really seen any of that variegation come out. So all in all, if you want my honest opinion about these flosses right now, I think it's probably better, less expensive to just go with the DMC floss. They have a lot of colors. I do love the Classic Colorworks colors, but I'm not sure money-wise if I feel like it's worth the investment. I know there's a lot of people that love this floss out there. Feel free to leave me a comment below if you love some of the hand-dyed flosses. They call it fancy floss because these are hand-dyed skeins, and I do appreciate that. The other thing I'm looking at is stitching. I was thinking it was going to be a little bit smoother to stitch with the hand-dyed flosses, and honestly I don't find much of a difference. As a matter of fact, sometimes I feel like this floss is just a little bit rougher than the DMC floss. So I don't know, I think it's all just personal preference, but I did just want to mention that since I've never used this and we are trying something new this year. I also wanted to show you the different colors right here in person so that you can see them next to each other, and then if you haven't started stitching yet, you can decide for yourself which colors you prefer. But anyways, here is my progress for block number 1. And I hope you guys are having fun. Don't forget to leave your progress in our Sew With Me group on Facebook. I'll make sure to link that below. All right, everyone, that is it for block number 1. I hope you enjoyed this block. I hope you learned something new and had fun. I can't wait to see all of your guys' progress. Don't forget to join our Sew With Me group in Facebook. That will be linked below this video. It is a private group, so no spammers, yay. And we have a lot of fun sharing all of our makes, and I love seeing all of your guys' creations and your different color schemes as well. So that's going to be it for today's video. Make sure you subscribe. You can also hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming uploads. I hope you enjoyed today's video for block number 1, and I will see you in the next video for block number 2.
My steam is hot today, guys.